Born in San Salvador, El Salvador, she is a member of the large wave of Salvadoran immigrants who arrived in Los Angeles in the early 1980s. She studies Latinx immigration laws, and her award-winning book, Sacrificing Families, Navigating Laws, Labor, and Love Across Borders, examines the well-being of Salvador immigrants and their families, both in the United States and in El Salvador, as those are shaped by immigration policies and gendered expectations. So without further ado, here she is.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. And I want to thank especially Jeanette and Catherine, who I was in touch with to get me here today, and for everyone who made this happen. I'm going to be talking about an area of research, but also just something that I've been involved in since 2001, that I've been working with undocumented young people in LA as someone who's an ally, as kind of accompanying them in their process of creating what is now a very vibrant immigrant rights movement. And so I've really been thinking about, because I was trained as a sociologist, what it means that we assume people will assimilate, when that's really not the goal for a lot of immigrants at all. And so starting from that, I'm trying to figure out, what do I call this? How do we name what we're doing? Because we are making home here. We are building ties, even if our goal is not to be whatever we think an American, a U.S. based person should be. So let me share with you what is a quote from someone who I met in 2001, who was an undocumented high school student, a very, very good student, very articulate and thoughtful young woman who was a leader at her school and just very confident overall. And when we sat down to talk about her experience of being undocumented, suddenly she was no longer that confident person. She was, kind of holding her stomach and fidgeting the whole time and really having a hard time talking about this because she hadn't told anyone at her high school. And so she says, well, I feel ashamed. I debated so many times whether to tell my counselor, because you're just scared to tell somebody because you don't know what they're going to think. And you're just so scared of that reaction because you do feel inferior to somebody because you don't have the same rights as they do. You feel inferior because you know they have more rights than you. So she's trying to figure out, where does this shame come from? She didn't know other people at her high school who were undocumented, so she didn't have a community to build from. And so this is 2001. A lot of the stories that I was getting from people were very similar. They felt ashamed, they felt stigmatized, they didn't know who to talk to. And then, fast forward 2010, these very same people were leading this movement across the country where they were very vocally demanding rights in this country. In fact, their main motto has become, starting since 2010, undocumented and unafraid. Fast forward 2015, the movement is no longer just for access to education, but it's about accessing health. It's about ending detention. It's about making sure that especially the most vulnerable trans detainees are treated humanely and that we end detention overall. And so the movement continues to shift and to get broader. And so how did we get here? How do you go from a 2001 kind of experience where it's all about stigma and fear to having this vibrant immigrant rights movement? And then how do people experience this path of activism, which I want to argue is another way of integrating, of making home in this space that has nothing to do with the way we've been studying migration. So again, I was trained as a sociologist. The majority of the work in that field that looks at migration thinks about assimilation, or we use the word integration. Overall, we're measuring how much do people make, where do they work, how much prestige does their job have, how much do they complete in terms of degrees, and the other thing we look at is how much do they intermarry with whites. And overall, we consider it a success if they are at the same level as whites on all of these categories, right? And especially we say, look, when they're intermarrying with whites, that means whites are accepting them, and so they've made it basically in this country. So all of the way that we think about assimilation or success of migrants is about parity with whites in much of the literature. And that's really not what people are interested in, not the people that I'm around, right? The communities that I work with. And so I had to look outside of the general immigration literature to think about, how do I explain what's happening with the immigrants that I work with, and think about the structures that are shaping their experiences. Immigration law in particular is such an important force in their lives. And so then how do people make sense of those laws? How do they navigate and interpret what they're living? And so I got a lot of great, lenses to think about all of this from law and society literature that thinks about legal consciousness, this concept that we come up with our understanding of law based on the different patterns that we see in society. And we internalize some of those things to the point that they shape the way that we act, the way that we make sense of the world around us, even the way that we relate to one another. And so I've been using this term to help me understand how people then navigate who they are in this society, even who they are within immigrant families where people have different statuses. All of this is made complicated by how we talk about immigration laws and how they actually play out, right? So you have the discourse of policymakers and law enforcement folks who say, it's pretty clear, law has this one purpose. We either follow it or we don't, and so we enforce it or not. And so we have detention and deportation as the main negative consequences for anyone who's undocumented. And, we try to talk about it just very simply, which is why you can have something like the Republican presidential nominees of the last election saying our goal is attrition through enforcement, using these kinds of words that are very sterile and law based, which really means we're going to make life hell for immigrants so that they will leave on their own. And now we're talking about the wall. It continues in different ways where we try to sterilize the language, but the laws have so many consequences, are much more complex than this, right? So in practice, these laws are very inconsistently enforced, and they vary. So what happens in one place is shaped by those local policies as well as by state laws and federal laws. And so what happens even in Riverside might be different than what happens in LA, than what happens in the Central Valley of California, than definitely what happens next door in Arizona, across the country, right? And so we can't say the law when there are these different layers at play all the time. And then to make things even more complex, those immigration laws also interact with laws that have to do with protecting students, laws that have to do with protecting workers, laws that have to do with protecting renters. All of these things, one doesn't erase the other, right? So it's much more complicated than that. But we have these mass media representations that tend to try to make it seem pretty easy, not complex. And we produce this notion of illegality. We produce the condition of what it means to be undocumented. And all of it together has these very far-reaching cumulative effects in people's lives. So, this idea that the right-wing anti-migrant folks use all the time, what part of illegal don't you understand, right? That idea that it's black and white here, it's just you either are or you're not. what don't we understand? And so there's been a lot of work around trying to piece out. There is nothing inherent in human beings that makes them documented, undocumented, right? And so we need to think about what is happening socially, politically, legally, economically in each historical moment that then defines what it means to be undocumented. And so when we do that, we realize that perception makes no sense. What it meant to be undocumented in the late 1800s versus the 1970s versus 2000 versus 2001 even, right, after 9/11 versus what it means right now during the Trump era. Those things vary because all these factors play into what that means to be undocumented. And so right now, it's very much about deportability, the fact that you can be deported and the categories of who can be deported and who's the main target and who's kind of protected, even all under the category of undocumented, is shifting. We're seeing that happen. It's also right now, and has been for a couple of decades now, about vulnerability, about long-term vulnerability. And this extended period of uncertainty. And so in the 21st century, legality has been about criminalization, right? Being undocumented was not always considered a criminal matter, not legally and certainly not in people's minds. And right now, legally, there's a push to really think of it in that way. There were moments in this country's history where being undocumented was really just a kind of civil matter, where just like getting a ticket for jaywalking, you would, be fined, but you're not thought of as a criminal. And that has changed, right? There's heightened policing. There are programs that are like secure communities, which really went into effect under President Obama's terms, that allows that funds local police forces to be deputized as immigration authorities. And that made it much more likely that you would stop someone for a broken taillight and they'd end up being categorized as criminal and detained and ultimately deported from the country in ways that we didn't used to see because we didn't combine those kinds of enforcement forces, right? So that's why we had record numbers of deportation, more than all presidents combined before under President Obama, over 3 million deportations. And right now we're looking to see whether it will stay the same or get even worse under Trump. So in my work with undocumented immigrants, what I've come to understand, and at a particular historical moment, right, for the first generation, for those people who migrated as adults, their legal consciousness, their understanding of what it meant to be undocumented and of what their life was here was really based in fear of being detained and deported because they're coming into a context of work where there's always the possibility of an ICE raid, where they can always be perceived as undocumented and excludable in that way, right? For the 1.5 generation, for those people who were born elsewhere but came here as children and have grown up here, it's a very different situation. They are also undocumented, but legally they have a right to public education through high school. So they came into this country and were in schools where no one was asking them about their status. They didn't even have to know a lot of the time until they finished high school. So they've gone to classes with all sorts of people who were not in their situation legally. They had no idea for a lot of them. And so when they come to learn of their undocumented status, what they feel is stigma. What their legal consciousness of being undocumented is that it's a really stigmatizing place to be. And so I'm interested, as someone who's an ally and involved in the immigrant rights movement, what do these things mean for themselves, for their experience of being in this country? About, yes, these things block their opportunities economically, in terms of education, in terms of their family well-being, but also in terms of their movement, right? For the immigrant rights movement, how do we make it possible for them to engage and to lead when they're living in fear or they're very stigmatized? And so it was a lot easier to overcome stigma than it was to overcome fear, to get people involved. And when people were able to start really shedding the stigma is when we saw people getting really involved in the immigrant rights movement. So in California, the way that this happened is that in 2001, thanks to the advocacy of a lot of especially educators who had been pushing for this for a while, and then as the young people themselves got involved and went to advocate for themselves in Sacramento, the Assembly Bill 540 was passed. And AB 540 was a bill that allowed them to qualify as state residents for the purpose of tuition. So they wouldn't have to pay international student rates to go to college anymore. And that made college more accessible. So we start to see in 2002 more people going to college in California, especially to community college, but some UCs, some Cal States here and there, right? Besides that kind of new access to higher education, what was really important about this is that it gave them a label. Since they were feeling so stigmatized at the time, suddenly AB 540 becomes a label that they can use that most other people won't recognize, but they can find each other through it. And so you start to see that professors and staff who want to help them out start putting these things on their doors all over campus. AB 540 safe zone, Ally AB 540. This is from different campuses in California. And that starts to, let everyone know we can support you. You find each other. There, at UCLA, there started to be flyers, AB 540 student meeting. And so people started finding each other and being able to share stories and to realize I'm not alone in this. There's growing awareness of this collective problem because the stigma had kept them to themselves in fear and shame prior to this, right? So as they realize this and start to analyze the situation, they are able to, start taking risks and really build this movement, right? So in the mid-2000s, AB 540 having been really established here in California, nationally, people are fighting for the DREAM Act, right? Nationally, they're fighting for access to college and a form of legal protection for those who are in school, who are going to go to college. And so that's how the term Dreamers came about, because they were pushing for this DREAM Act, right? And that, again, helps them to shed stigma. They're not using the undocumented label. A lot of them are still trying to hide that and not let others know about their status. But they're finding each other and gaining courage and knowing that they're not alone, right? So we start to see all of these actions, civil disobedience acts, a lot of organizations nationwide that are trying to figure out how do we all connect to make it a bigger force. 2010 is really the year when a lot of this becomes very visible nationally. Most because the goal was really about higher education and about people who had come in as were students. Most of the actions had people wearing their regalia, their graduation caps and gowns. But again, right, a lot of these young people are people who have now had a chance to go to college. They've studied social movements. They definitely have a mastery of technology, social media. They're really using YouTube and all sorts of different things online to share their stories, to further their stories. And all of that, and I've heard people in meetings from Tennessee, for example, where they didn't know anyone, things were not looking good, but they could go online and see that there were people in other states doing these things, and people in Georgia, and so they start to make these connections and feel like they're a part of this larger movement that's going on. So we see a lot of civil disobedience starting in 2010, taking over McCain's office, in Phoenix, Arizona, lots of people getting arrested over different issues right here in San Bernardino, right next door, I guess. And then as, they continue to think about what are we doing here? Once the DREAM Act did not pass in 2010, that was the closest it came to passing. They start to realize, can we really continue to fight just for us? Can we make this a bigger movement to really question what's happening to immigrants more broadly? And so they start to really question all of this legislation that is criminalizing their parents, basically, right? So they're pushing against that. Detention has been another key area where activists have really focused, because so many immigrants are being treated like criminals, right? Over getting caught for, these very minor infractions. So the one on the right is an image of, I don't know how they got up to the detention center, and they laid out this big banner that says, estamos con ustedes, no pierdan la esperanza, we're with you, don't lose hope. So across campuses, we see lots and lots of different events, people organizing activists to come and talk about what they've done in their states. There's lots of sharing. And one of the things that's been really interesting is that art has been at the center of all of it, people telling their stories in all of these different ways and making sure that it's a movement that is inclusive of different communities, even within the undocumented youth group, right? So queer, women, transgender, making sure that we understand that, there are intersections here of what this experience is, and that we can't leave all of that out when we're deciding that we're pushing for more rights in this country. And you see it in the way that their actions change as well. So the first year, 2010, Chicago was the first place where they held a Coming Out of the Shadows event, where they had a group of students and they invited media to come and they shared their stories in public. And this was a big deal at the time. I remember the first time we did it in LA, a lot of us allies were so nervous, but they were leading, and this is what they wanted to do. And they just asked for a lot of us to be there as observers because they didn't know what would happen. And so this is now an annual thing where people come out and do this. In the first years, it was just all about the students talking about needing access to higher education. And now we see they're bringing their parents. We see first generation immigrants coming to these as well and talking about broader issues. So all of these connections are being made. Undocunation was organized by artists, actually, and they were able to do this tour, nationwide tour. I don't know if any of you participated in those. I participated in the one at Berkeley, where they brought together people doing the research, the students themselves, lots of art being shared, lots of stories being shared. And so there's been this entire movement that has done its part to really get around the country, make the connections, and really question what is the goal here, right? So all of that, although they were not able to get the DREAM Act passed, is what gets, their activism is what gets credited the most for having President Obama sign DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals executive action, right? So his executive action gave them a 2-year protection from deportation, as well as a work permit. A lot of them were saying, we're college grads now and we can't work in our field. And so with this, they were able to work in their fields. And in most states, they got a driver's license. And so these things that maybe seem minor to some people were huge life-changing things for them and for their families. And that's what my research was really focused on. Now it's been 800,000 DACA recipients. So the project that this thing is based on is interviews with 3 members of immigrant families, the DACA recipient and 2 people, often their parents, sometimes their siblings, and they're mixed status. So the parents might be undocumented or might be U.S. citizens, the residents as well. They may have other categories. So that means they all have different access to rights in this country, right? But you're still a family, and you still kind of navigate all of this together in some ways. And so this is all based in the greater LA area, and all of the people that I talk to are Mexican, Salvadoran, or Guatemalan. And so activism, a group of the folks that I talk to are activists that have been involved in this movement in one way or another. And so activism has become the path through which they've taken ownership of this space and of their future in it, right? So one of the themes that comes up is that it has created a home for them. Flor said the group, when she joined them, she says they showed us how much like a family they were, how comfortable they were with each other, how they didn't care if they were undocumented, if they were citizens, lesbians, gay. They just saw each other as like a family. It felt homey. It felt that you walked in there and everyone was so nice. Like, how are you doing? It felt like it was my second home right there. This came up a lot, right? So being in these movements, being in a local coalition with other young people allowed them to create this for themselves in ways that the rest of society were not offering them. And it allows them to really think of this concept of community, to really take ownership of it. Martin says, it makes me feel good. It makes me feel like there's a sense of some community and sharing of stories. Sometimes, obviously, no one has the same story, but there are intersections within your stories, and you get a lot of, I get you. There's always that feeling I get, and working for something that you believe in and you know that that is not right. And you see it in numbers and you see it in stats, and working for something that's bigger than you. I love it because it's pretty cool. So making those connections, realizing that what they're going through individually is happening at a broader level, and that they can work together to do something about it, gave them a lot of meaning. Just as importantly, it also brought them a sense of security. They're all still undocumented, right? There's always that possibility of being detained. And so Ingrid shares, I know if anything were to happen to me, I can call Carlos and he could start an END campaign. That's what they were calling it for a while, Education Not Deportation campaign. So be able to make phone calls to ICE, to have actions, essentially a campaign around an individual being able to stay in the United States. And that's like people are being deported in massive amounts every day, thousands. And for a collective to be able to do that just for one individual takes a lot of effort. But I know that with the organizing that I've done in the community that I've worked for, I know that they would do that for me. And a lot of people don't have that privilege to be able to say, I'm connected to a community and there's this level of protection. So a lot of it was about giving each other the protection, the security that the state is not giving them, that they're not going to find in other places. And it does work, right? They saw it work with their friends who were in these situations, and they all know how to mobilize to protect them in that moment. There's a lot of leadership development that happens in these spaces as well. Sabrina says, I used to be a quiet person, and now I see myself leading groups. Speaking for that first time I came out of the shadows, so that event, right, coming out of the shadows, was horrible. But now I've improved so much in being able to inform the community and talking to undocumented students that are in high school and telling them my story and even motivating them to continue high school. I'm proud of the work I've done. So activism has provided them the space to pick up these tools that maybe they would not have anywhere else because they're not seen as the ones who should be the leaders, right? But these spaces force them to be the leaders. A lot of people, especially young women, told me I didn't want to be up there speaking. I wanted to support, but they made me. And so eventually after 10 times of doing this, I realized, hey, I am doing this. I can do this. So they're using that and then really seeing changes happen and wanting to continue to be involved. So Nancy says, through the org, the internal link, someone had sent out the information that the president, that Obama was going to make the announcement that deferred action was going to happen. So all the groups knew before he signed it that it would happen. So we were waiting for the news and the actual announcement, knowing that it was going to happen. It was good to know. I was amazed. I was actually amazed that the hard work paid off. Not amazed that he signed it, but that it paid off. So the fact that they were involved at this historical moment when they had such a big win also really powerfully shaped how they understand activism then as something that they need to do to finally make this place what they need it to be for themselves and for their families. And they're taking that and using it in different ways, right? So that work there, those leadership skills can be applied to different areas. Susana says, we've definitely made an impact on our campus. We were able to bring an AB 540 scholarship. We were able to bring ethnic studies courses on campus, have various cultural events, awareness issues for undocumented students. We were able to have a coming out of the shadows event. And so they see, right, these skills that they learned and taught each other through their activism, they apply it to different things. I had lots of other folks talking about now working on LGBT rights and now working on, different campaigns that are not just about immigration anymore. Eric says, I think I've learned to also be very open about things. There's always different vocabulary that you're learning, and especially from youth, because now I work with youth who are so knowledgeable around LGBTQ issues and identities that we learn from them too. And so because this activism has really been about being as inclusive as possible, and I'm not saying that they're always successful at that, but at least there's this, very conscious effort to do that. It's teaching them that this is how they have to be in their communities. This is who they are as people in those spaces, but outside of them as well. And they bring that kind of consciousness as who they are as members of this society. So Fabiola says, honestly, before I didn't really care about anything until I started becoming involved. Now I'm like, this isn't humane, people. Are you kidding me? Professionally, I do see myself doing a lot of paralegal work for the community. I don't think that's something I ever want to stop working with, the community. So they have this vision now, right? That there is a community here, that there is work that they can do for this community that matters to them, even if they started out, feeling unwelcome here, feeling that they weren't going to be able to have a path where they could really take ownership of who they are in this society. Activism has given them that in very concrete ways that allows them to visualize that here. So, just to remind you that this process has been a shifting one depending on what's happening with policies, but also just at the local levels and being able to make connections using technology to do all of that. So their goals have changed from just education related to then really thinking more broadly about what immigration is and who it's affecting when we talk in very negative terms about immigrants, and thinking even more broadly about social justice and working with different social movements as well. I see that happening more and more now. But in terms of it being a path to integration, it's really given them this sense of home, community, sharing their stories and knowing that they're not alone is so empowering for them and allows them to co-create an analysis of what's happening that then makes them want to be involved in creating the change, right? So there's that, and in the process, the leadership skills that they've developed, they can apply to different spaces. And I see that happening as they create change on their campuses, but also in their communities, in their schools. A lot of them who are working now in different nonprofit organizations. Many of the people I met in 2001, for example, are at the ACLU. They're at local immigrant rights organizations, but also different kinds of environmental protection kinds of organizations. Lots of different areas where they took what they learned through that process and are applying that to make inroads in different ways. So I'll leave it there. If anybody has questions they want to email, or I tweet about this stuff all the time. If you're on Twitter, I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
I don't have any fear in telling you that of the they have a fear themselves, and their observations from talking with some of those that voted for Trump, I can't believe they did it, they have their own fears about losing their own status, about jobs, about that you don't want to assimilate. Um, on several occasions, it was mentioned to me it would be great to have a dialogue about immigration that would ask the question, what would it take for American foreign assistance to develop in societies in El Salvador, Mexico, and Honduras, and Guatemala, where people weren't forced to leave? Could you comment on that?
Well, there's different pieces of what you just said, but your actual question was about what would it take in terms of U.S. foreign assistance. And part of the response that I think never gets talked about, or really not as often as I should, is what would it take for the U.S. to stop intervening to create the conditions that then force so many people to leave. Most of my work in El Salvador, people talked about not wanting to leave. They love their food. They love the nature around them. They love that they can, in El Salvador, there's lots of volcanoes and the ocean. They want to know that they have access to all of that, to a place that they call home. And they understand very clearly, because they know from their relatives and friends who have already migrated, that coming to the U.S. is going to mean racism and poor treatment and working really, really hard and not having that mobility anymore, not having leisure time anymore. They don't want that. But conditions keep getting worse and worse and worse. Free trade agreements that the U.S. imposes on them. In El Salvador, the civil war that the U.S. funded for 12 years, right? All of these things that the U.S. has created for the profits of corporations, that are great lobbies here. Those things I think need to be dealt with first. Now we have CARSI, the Central American Regional Security Initiative. U.S. is funding, and sending weapons, and it's getting into the hands of people who then make life very dangerous, and people are having to flee that. So I think that side of the question needs to be asked and discussed a lot more. And, because otherwise you can send, whatever they said, it's $1 billion for the region, but you're just, feeding this really corrupt system that you set up in the first place. So I think it's complicated. We don't hear those stories in the mainstream. We only hear, oh, here we are minding our own business, and these people just keep flooding us. And that's not correct.
You spoke that a lot of immigrants were coming out of the shadows to advocate for a lot of DACA, Dreamers, and a lot of policy. I know California is striving for some sort of pathway to California citizenship. There's a lot of fear as well that within the Trump administration, a lot of ICE agents are going to be flooding California as well. Do you think that that's a big hurdle for that California passport?
To be honest, I'm not familiar with this idea of the California passport. California is considered to be one of the most immigrant-friendly states, and its policies certainly suggest that. There's a lot of variation within California, so not everyone feels as welcomed here as the policies suggest that they are. But in terms of the Trump administration and what they're doing against immigrants, we're seeing some of those shifts in terms of the discourse, in terms of the practices of not keeping to what Obama did, where he tried to make it seem like there's good immigrants and there's bad immigrants. His famous line was like, we're deporting felons, not families, right? This idea that it's one or the other, and no one, is in families where there's mixtures, or that is no longer the case under the Trump administration. They're just saying, no, anybody is a target now. But when cases have happened where there's been these campaigns to end deportations, they kind of step back and say, no, really, we're aiming for the criminals, whatever that means. That's a really problematic concept as well. But we're still kind of in this phase of trying to see what are they really going to do. Their discourse is horrible, but in practice, they're doing the same thing that Obama was doing so far. So it's hard to know yet. And that, I think, part of what really scares people and part of what is making this moment so difficult for so many is that we don't know. But the words are really, really horrible, right? They're completely racist and dehumanizing of entire populations.
Yes, thank you very much. Could you say something about the status of the DACA program now as Trump has come to power? Will they actually continue to renew the 2-year deferred actions, or are they going to revoke it entirely?
We don't know. We don't know. When he was campaigning, he said that was one of the first things to go, and yet he hasn't done it. And in a lot of the public discourse coming from the White House and from him, they've done a few things where they've said, don't worry, we're not going to mess with them. We're going to be kind. They're using that kind of language, but we have heard now of at least one person who was deported who had DACA, and it's been a big deal. People are making a big deal out of it. The person is suing because he's supposed to be protected under that. He hasn't talked about ending it quite yet, and he hasn't removed it. But everyone's still sort of waiting. He could decide just to let whoever has it now take its course, so it ends after their 2 years. That's one possibility. He could end it. We don't know. He hasn't done anything with it so far.
Why do you think he hasn't? If he won on this really anti-immigrant stance, and I know there's the politics of it all, why hasn't he just signed the executive order to do it? If he could, if he came to power as
I am definitely not an expert on Trump and would never want to be. So I don't know what he's thinking. I don't know. I honestly...
you see a national network, I guess, of undocumented students that are still currently trying to work with the administration, or is it just
As far as I know, people are not trying to work with the administration, but they are, now the campaign is here to stay, right? Hashtag here to stay. There's definitely a moment of trying to figure out, okay, where are we now? And this is, again, right? Illegality, new moment. What does it mean? Can we still be undocumented and unafraid? And some people are trying to push in that direction. Or do we go back to, hiding back in the shadows? And some people really are very scared and are heading in that direction. All of it is shifting as we try and figure out what happens next. But I'd say that given that there was this period of building this movement, including allies, those allies and a lot of the really fierce activists are trying to figure out, how do we maintain that momentum? How do we not lose all of it? And I'd say that if he were to overturn it, people will, make their voices heard about it.
I think I cut off one more signal.
Well, I wanted to ask a question about sort of the discourse that's used. A lot of it, when we talk about migration, a lot of it seems to be kind of compartmentalized by who's the president at the time. And my question is it really so easily distinguishable to kind of to categorize these things as like who's in the office and who's not? And really, does it obfuscate larger patterns or larger trends that go beyond party politics or this method of isolating historical moments to who's in power?
I think that's a good question, and I think there's not an easy, clear answer, because some of these things are set in place, and the patterns that we see go on the same for decades. We see that, but on the other hand, presidents do create policy, right? And presidents, as we're seeing right now, also allow for new forms of discourse that are acceptable or not acceptable, that play out in how immigrants live their lives. So it would not have been acceptable to talk about people of color the way that we're hearing now so frequently everywhere around us if we didn't have a president, that's we're emulating him basically, right? So they matter. They're in some ways they are distinct, and you can see different things going on. But there's a lot of power in being able to establish laws and create those practices that have day-to-day consequences.